Good morning, everyone. Bom dia a todos. Welcome to another MELSI Lab session. We are about to start today's presentation with Professor Alexandra Wake, that we thank you very, very much for being here with us. The presentation, which is going to be here presented by Professor Alexandra Wake, the title is The View from Australia, Media Literacy, the News Funding Crisis and Digital Citizenship. I'm just going to make a very brief introduction of the very extensive CV of Professor Alexandra Wake, who is a programs manager for journalism at RMIT University and was elected president of the Journalism Education and Research Association of Australia. Professor Alexandra Wake has been an active leader, educator, and researcher in journalism. Research, teaching, and practice that sits at the nexus of journalism practice, journalism education, equality, diversity, and mental health. Also, Dr. Wake has taught journalism at RMIT, Deakin University, Dubai's Humans College, and was a trainer on international aid projects, including the South African Broadcasting Corporation. And before turning full-time to the academy, Alexandra Wake spent more than 25 years working for broadcasting, print, international news agencies in Australia, Asia Pacific, and also Middle East. Alexandra Wake has been an education advisor for Mindframe for journalists since 2012, and the Dart Center Journalism and Trauma Academic Fellow in 2011. Professor Alexandra has been a part of the team of researchers in the International UNESCO Win-Twin Network on Gender, Media, and ITC, which promotes promoting and developing international co-participative projects together with the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Again, it's a great pleasure and honor to have here Professor Alexandra Wake with us, and we are truly looking forward for this presentation of yours. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation to join you this morning, your time, and this evening, my time. And I apologize already. We've had some slight technical issues with my PowerPoint, but hopefully this presentation will work. Before I begin, I would like to make an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and the Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands I live and work. I respectfully acknowledge ancestors and elders past and present. I also acknowledge all other traditional custodians and ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia and to traditional landowners across the world. It's a very important part of what we do at RMIT. Australia, as you know, was settled as a penal colony by the British, and the land that we work on is unceded, and we do very much acknowledge that we were uninvited guests. So this presentation is talking about media literacy, the news funding crisis, and digital citizenship, but I'm going to take a diversity lens in my presentation and talk quite a bit about gender and issues that relate to what we call in Australia culturally and linguistically diverse communities. I'm going to talk about the current state of media literacy here, media ownership, some information around digital citizenship, representation, and then talk about what we're doing into the future. I'm going to rely on a number of reports by a number of government and non-government agencies. I will provide at the end a reference list, and hopefully everything is properly cited along the way, and I've put those slides on there. I do just want to put a little bit of this in context for you. So here I'm coming to you from Melbourne, Australia, so at the bottom of Australia. I have had 215 days of lockdown in this town. We are in what we call lockdown 6, so we're not allowed to go more than 5 kilometres from our home. We're only allowed to exercise for 1 hour a day, and that's been going on for most of those 215 days. I'm also homeschooling. The last haircut I had was in February this year. The last physical class I had with students was in March last year. My last in-person journalism team meeting was in February last year. However, the state of Victoria, where Melbourne is the capital, now says it can't beat Delta, although in a positive way, the vaccinations are now up at 12.4 million nationally, and of Australians over 16 with 1 vax. So hopefully we won't be in this for too much longer, and we will not have to stay home, and we'll be able to start traveling again. So I think it's important when we're talking about Australia for you to have an understanding about the kind of country we are. We have 25.6 million people in Australia, of which 50.4% are female. 58% are Australians of Anglo-Celtic background, 21% non-European, 18% European, and 3% Indigenous. We are a liberal democracy, and we have a conservative government at the moment. You'll see as I talk today that we have among the highest levels of media ownership concentration in the world. We have no press freedom guarantees in our constitutional law. Since 2001, there have been 80 new or amended laws impacting on press freedom in this country. And although you'd think we were an advanced country, we're only 25 on the World Press Freedom Index. And a very worrying statistic when we're talking about media literacy is our actual low literacy. The OECD says 1 in 5 Australians have very low literacy and numeracy skills. Well, further to the sort of state of the nation, we have 2 state-funded broadcasters, the ABC, which is very much like the BBC, and SBS, which is a multicultural broadcaster, very much like in the BBC mode, but with an emphasis on our various cultural and language groups. We have 3 commercial free-to-air television networks, 1 pay television network, multiple papers, radios, online news services. And like everywhere else in the world, our news services are facing financial challenges, audience changes, and economic impacts. And in recent years, we've seen a massive increase in streaming services. Netflix, Stan, Disney, we seem to have it all these days. As I outlined at the beginning, literacy is problematic in Australia across many sections of the population, and media literacy, which is different, is additional to that. There's been some really good work done recently by the Adult Media Literacy in Australia group, and they have put out this report which says that adult media literacy education has not been supported in Australia in a significant or sustained way by governments. In fact, 2 years ago, I could actually say there was no group monitoring media literacy at all. No one had studied it until this report. But Australians do use different types of media each day, and Australians believe that there is a diverse range of media activities are actually important to their lives, but confidence in their media abilities is unexpectedly low, and Australians don't have access to any media literacy when they need support for it. Here's just a little graph of the kinds of media use that Australians use. And as you'll see there, the social media is the most used kind of media in Australia, followed by free pay-to-air television. This report also found that the more types of media people use each day, the higher their levels of civic engagement, which I would imagine is the same in most other countries. They've measured civic engagement from a range of perspectives, but it's about, for us in this report, it's about what is happening in politics, attending public rallies, signing petitions, and actually taking part in civic events. So here's a list of the kinds of things that they've looked at: keeping up to date on politics, talking to others about issues, signing a petition, commenting on social policy, following a party or a politician. 4 out of 10 Australians have not undertaken any of the 7 civic engagement activities in the past year. Heavy users of social media are almost 4 times more likely to have high levels of civic engagement compared to non-users. So, people who sit on media all day, people like me, tend to be, highly civically engaged, but others certainly not. The more types of media people consume daily, the higher their level of civic engagement. And almost half of all people with the lowest level of media ability have not undertaken any civic engagement activities in the past year. There's some really big gaps in media literacy. Only 23% say they can edit a video and post it online. What I found really interesting with these stats, however, was ones that I actually thought were impossible for most of us. This last one, 45% say they can change their social media privacy settings, which I thought was quite interesting. And but only 26% say they can interpret a social media platform's data collection policy. I actually think that sounds a little too high for me. On this graph, we're looking at daily, what people are using, on a daily basis. As I said before, social media is by far the most often used or daily used media, followed by free-to-air television. And news, unfortunately, is quite low. A lot of people are still using video games, more video games than newspapers in print these days. And as I outlined earlier, Australians have actually quite low levels of media literacy in particular groups. So older people, and I think that's a global trend. So the over 75s have 75% have a very low level of media literacy, followed by that next age group of 56 to 74. And of course, that age group is the ones that predated computers. So that's not too surprising. They didn't go to school when computers were around, but 56% of a low level of education also have low levels of media literacy. That makes sense. But these other ones are quite concerning. 48% of people living with a disability, those on low incomes, living in regional Australia, where access to Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi is often quite problematic. And 30% of all Australian adults are said to have low level of media literacy. When we look at what's going on for women, they are less likely to have a higher level of media ability, and men are actually 6% more likely than women to fall into the highest category of media ability. So yeah, men, there's a bigger group of men who are actually in that very high media ability area. Women like to use media to stay in contact with friends and family. And interestingly, so are what we call in Australia CAL, the culturally and linguistically diverse groups. They find media really, really important. In fact, the culturally and linguistically diverse Australians were found to have a high level of digital consumption. And that actually does make sense when you think about it. It's not something that I think most people would have initially thought, but actually, if you think about it, it's because the media doesn't really represent culturally and linguistically diverse Australians. They have used digital much more than others. Unfortunately, a byproduct of being online is that offensive content is more often seen by groups, by culturally and linguistically diverse Australians and Indigenous people. They have a very high level of abuse online. And just to point out here, this is the culturally and linguistically diverse group. So much higher use of digital media than almost any other group, except for the very highly educated. The one thing that's had a lot of attention in Australia in the last wee while has been the media bargaining laws. And I pulled this one out of The Guardian because it mentioned Portugal. But Australia has, as I said earlier, one of the highest levels of newspaper ownership concentration by country. So clearly China's up there, followed by Egypt, then Australia. But actually, I was quite surprised to see that you weren't all that far behind. So most of our newspapers, or a large percentage of them, are owned by Rupert Murdoch and his News Corporation. And here is a slide. So 51.9% owned by News Corporation, which is Murdoch. And then there's these Australian community media, 9, 7, and independent. There's some wonderful work done by the government on who owns what, and there's a couple of bubbles here. It's an interactive map which won't work on this, but if you push on the button for Rupert Murdoch, you'll actually find out how much he does own. There's also another button there for News Corporation and another one for Lachlan Murdoch. So those three are actually basically, you know, they're all Murdoch. And I will go through why that's problematic in this next slide. So for example, until recently, every single daily newspaper in Queensland was owned by Murdoch News Corporation. Why does that matter? Because some of the biggest issues of our time are focused right on Queensland. So Queensland is the home of the Great Barrier Reef. It is also home to some of the biggest coal fields, you know, in the world. And the Courier Mail and Rupert Murdoch have taken a very strong editorial line that there's nothing going wrong with the reef and that coal is good and coal is good for jobs. And they have run this line through their papers, in every paper, for years now. So just for having one person constantly on this vendetta over climate change is really problematic, not just for Queenslanders or Australians, but for the world. One of the major problems that have occurred over the sorry, I feel like I've skipped something there. During the pandemic, we have lost a lot of newspapers, just like everywhere else in the world. There has been problems with advertising revenue. COVID basically killed off, many of our newspapers. Many stopped going from print and to only into digital platforms. And this has been particularly difficult in regional and rural communities, which, as I said, don't have access necessarily to the internet, and haven't been able to get any decent news over this period. There's been a 9% reduction in the number of journalists that's measured only to 2016. It's been even worse over the last year. And there's also been drastic declines in the coverage of public interest news. And when I say public interest news, I mean news about local governments, courts, and science. I was talking a little bit about Murdoch and his influence, and he does own here these right-leaning papers, the Australian Sky News, the Fin Review. But I do want to make clear that we do have, a good range of other news organisations and papers, but they just don't have as many, and they don't, as I was saying, that all of Queensland is covered by News Corporation, where some of these other ones, which are excellent award-winning news organisations, aren't much outside the southeast part of Australia. The Public Interest Journalism Initiative has actually been mapping over the last 2 years the newspapers that have been closing and merging. It's been quite concerning to watch. So there's been 216 contractions, 110 expansions. That depends on how you count that, but at least 106 news organisations that have closed over those 2 years. And just in the July report from them, these were the decreases in services. As you can see, a whole heap of regional television stations have closed down. So, you know, there might be one opening. The Washington Post has opened in Sydney, you know, great for the Washington Post and for people who read American, but not so great for regional communities. And again, a lot of these are in Queensland, where those big coal and climate issues are. The Australian government, however, does recognise that news is an essential service, and during the pandemic did offer 55 million Australian dollars for a public interest news gathering program. So they actually gave grants to newspapers to keep going, and they also paid JobKeeper. So over the first couple of lockdowns, there was money available for journalists to claim, so they could just keep on working even though their newspapers weren't making money. JobKeeper has now stopped, so that's currently now not there. But the big news was the passing of the news bargaining code, which means that Google and Facebook have to make deals with major media outlets for the news that they take and put onto either onto Facebook or onto Google. It is a world first and has set a precedent for other jurisdictions and as well for the future of Australian news. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission set up the code, and it was really, you know, forcing Google and Facebook to pay for news. They really wanted them at the negotiating table. You may remember that Facebook responded by pulling all news off all news off the Australian Facebook site across the world. It was quite confronting to wake up and discover that there was nothing there. But they didn't just take news services. They took the student newspaper. They took information from health bodies. Yeah, it was quite frightening when we realized how much we had handed over to Facebook in terms of communication to the public, not just for news, but, you know, the local footy team. It was frightening. Fortunately, Facebook did come back to the table. There are some things that those big platforms now have to do, including, and I think really important, giving 14 days notice of algorithmic changes. So if they're going to change something on how news is circulated, they actually have to tell news organisations what they're going to do. The news publishers are able to bargain collectively, which is useful. But to get the money, they have to be covering things that are important, like local government issues, courts and events, and engage their community in public debate. It has given journalism in Australia a financial boost at a very important time. Businesses can bank on a form of sustained revenue from Google. Previously, Google and Facebook have sort of handed out money at particular times, but, you know, no one ever knew when it was going to come or how long it was going to stay for. So now they've actually got sustained revenue. Google has signed multi-million-dollar deals. Now, all of these are actually commercial in confidence, so we don't officially know how much money they are paying, but we understand that they're giving $30 million each year to both Channel 7 and Channel 9. Smaller outlets like the academic publishing place, The Conversation, you might have seen it, they haven't got anywhere near that because they didn't know what others were getting. So it's been difficult for some of them to bargain, and certainly for the smaller players, very, very difficult. News Corporation has received significant payments, but again, we don't know the exact form of that. What we do know is we can no longer rely on Facebook for easy engagement and audience growth, and whether by choice or necessity, news organisations are looking for readers elsewhere now. Now, even though all of this money has flowed to our news organisations, it hasn't stopped News Corporation cutting jobs. So even after the News Corp Chief Executive Robert Thompson announced that the 2021 financial year was the most profitable year since we created the new News Corp in 2013, they've been cutting more jobs. Let's hoping that is coming to an end soon. The Journalists Union here in Australia has been very concerned about those job losses, and Adam Potelli says news is also set to reap millions of dollars from deals with Facebook and Google under the news bargaining code, which must be invested into journalism. News must reconsider any proposed cuts. Unfortunately, he can say that as much as he likes, it hasn't stopped News Corp doing what it wants to do. You may also now be aware that, and this is probably the first time I've ever spoken quite so publicly or critically of News Corporation. They have been very powerful, but even our former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, who's pictured there, and another Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, have come out and called for a royal commission into Murdoch's domination of the Australian media scene, and there is actually a Senate inquiry underway at the moment into media diversity. Actually, Kevin's appeared once and he will appear again on Monday to take it further. There is a very clear feeling in Australia that there are too few voices and too much power is invested in those voices. Now to digital citizenship and news. So here in Australia, like every other country, is doing digital news reports. The Australian report found that trust in news has risen here in the same way it is, globally. Interest in news has been declining among Australian audiences. I think we're too busy watching Netflix. And interest in news during the pandemic, went up, but then came back down again. There is a lot of concern about false and misleading information online, and women are concerned that they're not seeing themselves portrayed well in the media. The digital report also found, as I was saying earlier with the media literacy, that Australians with low literacy are less likely to know their political orientation. They're more likely to have a low interest in news and politics, and 1/10 are extremely low or non-users of news, and they're more likely not to know if the news represents them fairly or sufficiently. The digital news report also found that almost half of those who use Facebook for news say they mainly see news while they're on it for other reasons. And interestingly, Australia has a reputation for being early adopters of technology. Mobile phones are now used by 63% of Australians to get news, and it is the main device for 45% of people. Women are more likely to come across news on social media. They're more likely than men to use social media to access news. So they share a lot more online. Women use fewer mediums. Women use Facebook for news more than men, and younger women, I think I've already said that, believe that they're not covered enough. They don't get enough coverage of their gender, and they think that what is there is unfair. So let's talk about this representation and why women and culturally diverse groups are upset, and for very good reason. Again, let's just go through some facts. There is underrepresentation of women in the news media, particularly at senior levels. There is the highest level of workplace sexual harassment of all industries in Australia. So the media has the highest level of workplace sexual harassment in all industries in Australia. There is a lesser quality of representation of women in the media. So generally to date, although I'm about to give you some updated figures, they haven't been in prime time. They've been used less traditionally as sources of news. There is an entrenched, systemic and widespread gender pay gap for women, particularly journalists and newspapers. Women undertake more precarious work and are more highly represented in part-time and freelance work. Women report that they're being silenced as a result of abuse, particularly that received online, and that there's a lot of sexualized portrayals of and comments directed at women, particularly sports women and sports commentators, and work environments are generally not family friendly, which make it very difficult. I just wanted to show you this tweet by this fantastic young female footballer, Taylor Harris. And when I say footballer, I mean Australian football. It's called, it's not the round ball. This image of Taylor, and I think you can see here, here's a pic of me at work. Think about this before your derogatory comments, animals. She got absolutely the most horrendous abuse after this picture was taken. It actually won a journalism award because it is such a great picture of someone, of a sportswoman, and it's now been turned into a statue. This is she's actually outside the MCG in that pose, but she got the most vile abuse online. And it kind of sort of sums up everything that women get in the media in Australia. So the Global Media Monitoring Project, which some of you might be across, it's a global project. In the Australia report, it found that women and girls remain unrepresented as sources of news in Australian journalism, and that females make up less than 1/3 of people who were quoted or discussed in the sampled Australian news stories. So for this project, they looked at news on one particular day and did a count. So finding that women and girls remain unrepresented as sources and they're quoted and discussed less. They did, however, find on this day that they surveyed that women had achieved parity as reporters and presenters for the first time since the monitoring project began in 1995. So bylines and appearances as reporters were approximately equal. So there was just 49% of women and 51% male. Men were more dominant in radio and women are more prominent in television. However, while there might be parity there between men and women have formed the vast majority of students in Australian journalism degrees since the 1980s. So for almost 50 years, there's been more women than men graduating in journalism, but they certainly aren't represented in the numbers in newsrooms and certainly not in senior management positions within newsrooms. I won't go through all of these, but this is, for example, the most frequently quoted position or occupations, female sources, only 24% were used when they were talking about or talking to members of politicians or members of parliament. And that probably represents pretty much what our federal parliament is like at the moment. Even in our cabinet, we only have one female member of cabinet at the moment, or maybe two. They've just had a reshuffle. There's another really good report that was done a couple of years ago in 2019 called "You Can't Be What You You Can't Be What You Can't See." And in this one, they found that women were missing from news stories and from feature stories. They were missing from photographs, both as photographers and as subjects, and were missing in that very influential place in Australian media landscape. Our voices are missing from opinion pieces and columns. So there has been some change, but not as much as we like. And as I said before with that photo I showed you of Taylor, that sportswomen and sports commentator face a tirade of sexist and belittling comments. More than a quarter of all comments on sports stories are sexist, sexualized, belittle women's sport, or otherwise negative in nature. And in this study, they even looked at the way stories were written. So if a female athlete did well, it was always the male coach or the partner that was used, to give them credit for, for the female success. We even had that at the recent Olympics where one of our female athletes won gold and the stories were all about her male coach. Again, another problem we have, it's not just about gender, it's also about the culturally and linguistically diverse. 75% of on-screen news presenters have an Anglo-Celtic background in Australia. 70% of television journalists rated representation of culturally diversity as either poor or very poor, and 77% of respondents with culturally diverse backgrounds believed their background was a barrier to career progression. Interestingly, of all of the national news directors, 100% were Anglo-Celtic. That's the national ones. There's certainly there is some difference in states, particularly here in Victoria, where we do have a larger a larger number of diverse people in the state. But this is this year's New South Wales Journalism Awards. Of the 60 judges, every single one of them was white. 15 women, 5 called Peter, 3 called Andrew, and a few Pauls and Chris's, but not a single one a person of colour. So that is something that we are very concerned about. One of the problems that's experienced not just by women, but by women of colour or women from cultural and linguistic backgrounds and Indigenous women is the abuse. And they are abused online and harassed, and particularly that younger age group. 47% of people aged between 18 and 24 reported that they had received online abuse or harassment. 37% of women had experienced harassment that at least one occasion, these experiences made them feel that their physical safety was threatened. I actually had a case only last week where I felt that from someone who I had posted a story online, and I had someone in my local community post out personal details of my address as a female academic. Just quite crazy stuff. Australian employers do not always protect their staff, particularly freelancers, from this kind of abuse because they haven't to date seen it as an extension of the workplace. And Amnesty's toxic Twitter report found that every 30 seconds, a woman journalist is harassed online. There's been a bit of work done about the trolling of women here, and I know in other countries there's been a great, excellent report I think Julie Pizzetti has done with some of our colleagues here in Australia about the trolling of women and calling it an economic vandalism because it does actually cost people their careers and jobs. And this was a comment from an Australian academic in Don't Read the Comments. Reputational harm caused by defamatory statements online is a common concern for women journalists. If misinformation spread by trolls is believed, it can have serious ramifications on their trustworthiness as perceived by sources, employers, and colleagues. And that's certainly something that that the trolls do. They go after particular journalists. And another report, so so many reports are saying a lot of the same things and looking at this with in different ways and with different measures, but they're all finding that Australian women working in the media are subject to actual and threatened gendered violence. Those who write about gender inequality are more likely to be freelance journalists, and because of the subject matter are more likely to be targeted for abuse. And that women increasingly find themselves working in freelance roles without institutional support, often alone and in their own home and with unstable incomes, grappling with the gig economy. And women become freelancers because that's what you do, because you can't, look after kids necessarily and work shift work in a newsroom. Ginger Goldman, who wrote this great book called Troll Hunting, she actually went out and spoke to those people who say terrible things online. She said, it's a very precarious existence, not helped by the fact that when we get death threats, we are reading them in our own homes, often with no one around, let alone colleagues or bosses. She's a really great speaker and really powerful on this subject. Now, I've said lots of sad things, so I want to kind of just mix it up a bit. We have got a lot of advocates for change. So Gen Vic, women in media diversity, there's a lot of groups trying to change the conversation around gender and culturally, linguistically diverse communities. So I don't want to say that that's all bad. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation has done some awesome work following on the 50-50 project, which the BBC has done. So in 2018, without sort of telling anyone in the public, they introduced a challenge for their journalists to approach women as experts before contacting male experts, and to keep a record of who was approached and for what reason. And Gavin Morris, who is the head of news, said at the time, the statistics were pretty shocking to us. We were way out of proportion on the gender balance issue. We had a real wake-up call because although we although we have had gender diversity front of mind, we still weren't doing very well with it. And anyway, good news is that in March this year, the ABC achieved the target of having female and male interviewees equal numbers and contributors. And the exact March result was 51% of female voices. So that was pretty exciting to see. And they're clearly going to continue on with that. But not only that, they're now going to go on to broaden from gender to include underrepresented groups, which they refer to as an Indigenous Australians. Remember, the 3% of the population I talked at the very beginning of this talk, people from culturally and linguistically diverse communities, which is a very large group, and it's not a great kind of wording, but you know, I was talking to actually an Indigenous elder today, and he said, you know, it's a way of sort of othering. It's Alex. It's one of the, you know, it's a words that you use when you just want to other people. You know, they're not us. But anyway, that's the official terms. And people with a disability who have been really poorly represented in the media here. There's been other good things, and fair play to the News Corporation. The Herald Sun actually banned comments on the women's football, the AFLW, and they've actually said after vile posts by readers, one story contained almost 300 comments of grossly sexist tone, which were moderated out for publication. They've chosen to close reader feedback on the women's football, except in rare circumstances. So at least they're trying to stop it. It's not just the people that it's directed at, it's the people that moderate it, it's the people who read it. It's just really bad. So here we go, more future thinking, what are we doing? So there's a lot of education that needs to happen in Australia. So the Adult Media Literacy in Australia group has called for you know, an advocacy campaign. I think we can all sign up for that. They want media literacy initiatives to prioritise Australians who are most likely to be at risk of having low media literacy. So, you know, those older people, the low education groups. They want people to work together, which is clearly something that should happen. They want initiatives to be very broad-based because many people reported that they get as much information from entertainment media as they do from news media. So, and I think that that's something that journalists should be concerned about, but that's something I think that does need to happen. They want a networked approach to media literacy and more education support and media literacy in schools. Although every time I hear someone say that, I think, goodness, do you not know what teachers are doing? I think teachers are actually already doing a lot of that. It's not the kids I'm worried about so much. There's also a lot of work going on in industry at the moment. Almost every week there is some kind of training initiative by either Media Diversity or someone like the Walkley Foundation, which is the body that represents the Journalists Union. This one's coming up in a couple of weeks, media training and inclusive reporting that represents Australian diversity. You wouldn't want to put a panel out anywhere in Australia at the moment that didn't have a woman on it, and no one who was actually thinking would try to put on a panel on anything without ensuring that there was some kind of cultural diversity as well. Within the Academy and in my role as the elected president of the Journalism Education and Research Association, I am trying to create opportunities for gender and cultural diversity education. One of the things, however, that gets in the way of this is that, and I'll go back to a piece of research by Louise North in 2010, and I don't think things have changed. Journalism educators are not aware of, interested in, or informed about gendered issues in relation to journalism production and media content, nor do they have a good understanding of the depth, history, and importance of this scholarship. And she further noted that journalism educators teach what they know and what they're most comfortable with politically and culturally. And so we are trying to directly target those. And to be clear, there are only 3 of us in Australia who are actually working actively in the journalism, gender research space. it's only part for each of us. It's only part of our work. So I think there's a lot more to be done nationally on that. However, in my own university, which is I can control a little bit more because, you know, you've always got your own sphere of influence. At my university, we have the RMIT ABC fact check unit. So the ABC, the national broadcaster, has an office on our campus when we're on campus, and that does fact checking. So that's a really important part of media education to, you know, to get those out. We also have a fact check lab. So that's actually, I think, funded by Facebook. I can't remember who's funding that one, but those fact checks go out as well around coronavirus. We have a mandatory course on fact checking and verification. So every one of the journalism students who graduates in journalism must do that course. And it's open as an elective to anyone else in the university. We have embedded lectures on gender and diversity. And at the end of this year, I'm organising a roundtable on the importance of fact checking as core journalism curriculum. So that's what I can do. And I think that's where I'm going to end it. So I will stop sharing and throw back to you guys. Oh, and sorry, I should have said I do have a whole heap of useful links if anyone wants them.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for such a comprehensive and detailed presentation. Big round of virtual applauses to you, and well, and not only, but also. Before I ask everyone here today in this webinar for questions or comments on the presentation, please allow me to make a first question for Warmup. Regarding the first part of your presentation, more connected with media literacy in Australia, could you please provide a bit more of detail when the field work was conducted, what was the sample of participants? Probably it was a quantitative survey, I believe, and if there is a plan to make a second round of that same survey, I would assume that there are some significant changes in these times of COVID-19, and if you could elaborate a little bit more on those, on that basic information about that particular study, I would really would thank you a lot.
I'm just trying to pull it up in the background so I get that right for you. Look, it is actually just out. So it's a 2021 survey, and it was 3,510 adult Australians, and they actually did it in a number of languages. But I can send you that full report if you would like to have a look at that. It's really got some interesting information in it, and yes, they do intend to repeat it. It was the first time that anyone had done anything like that, and as I said 2 years ago, it didn't exist, and it's been pulled together by a number of people and media teachers here in Australia. There's a group called the Australian Teachers of Media, ATOM, and they did it. So it's so it's
done quite recently. The field work was done in 2000 in this year already.
I think it was 20. I'll just double check.
If I may ask, what was for you the most surprising result out of this survey? Which was for you more mind-blowing, if I may use the expression?
Yeah, it was July, August 2020, so the middle of last year. To me, it was the culturally, linguistically diverse groups being so digitally active, which I should have realized that, and I'm surprised I didn't realize that. But it makes sense because the media doesn't actually work very well for many of those groups. And throughout COVID, we've constantly had this refrain in the media that particular ethnic groups in Australia have not been getting the right messages around COVID. And I knew that work was actually being done, so that there was a lot of messaging, but it wasn't showing up in the mainstream media. And so that to me was, well, yeah, of course it wasn't showing up where mainstream journalists could find it, because it was in closed groups, in WhatsApp groups, in Telegram and Signal, in all sorts of other places, and in language, not in English.
Thank you very much. So now questions and comments from our esteemed audience. Who wants to start first? And by the way, the presentation, as we mentioned in the first minutes, will be made available online on YouTube. So hopefully more people will be able also to see, not directly like we are doing right now, but to see it afterwards. This webinar is concluded in a few days.
I'd actually like to know how that compares with Portugal, and where we sit in comparison to you. Have you done similar work, and have you got the similar kinds of issues to us here?
That's a good question. Probably not so comprehensive. Probably there are several reports with indicators which you referred to during this presentation, but not something so focused on media literacy. But probably Maria José and Carla can elaborate a bit more on that.
Yes, thank you. Carla, do you want to
maybe. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you very much. For me, it was a very interesting presentation. Of course, not only related with the media literacy, but also with the gender and diversity issues, of course. And the data, for example, I was thinking that the data from the GMMP in Portugal is a bit similar. I read the last report, and I was active in the last monitoring, and it was similar. And we have, for example, we are starting a project about women journalists' hate speeches in Portugal. And I feel that we need to talk more about this kind of abuse and harassment in newsrooms, because we feel that women journalists in Portugal, they don't want to talk about this kind of topics. And we don't have data about that. Another thing that I was wondering is if you have I don't know if you have gender and diversity, gender equality and diversity plans in the media sector, mainly in the public sector, and the impact of this kind of measures.
Yeah, there certainly are within the public sector. There are things that the universities have to do, the media have to do around gender and diversity. But yes, the commercial media don't have the same regulatory requirements, and so they don't. One of the other issues that has come out really clearly in the Australian research too is that men don't see the abuse. So if someone's on Twitter and they're attacking a woman, they will only generally attack a woman to her account. And so even if someone else in her colleague sitting right beside her in a newsroom, when we used to sit beside each other, he won't necessarily at all see what's going on for her. And that's been a really big issue in trying to bring men up to speed on that. And like literally swapping phones and saying, look, we said the same thing, but look at the abuse you've gotten and look what I've gotten. And it's really quite mind-blowing for men here. Yeah, I've often myself not seen abuse that has come. I monitor quite carefully what's happening with our graduates online, particularly over COVID. There's been some really nasty attacks on journalists over COVID. And yeah, and I haven't necessarily seen the worst of it because of the way it's sent to people, you know, direct messages or just sent to them. And, you know, you can't necessarily see it.
May I ask a question? It's a general question, although we could also see the importance of community media in Australia, as far as I understood. So in regarding to gender issues, is there any difference in community media comparing to mainstream media, or not really?
I didn't really pull out the community media so much. I pulled out the public sector, the ABC and SBS, and the commercial media. The community media sector here is actually quite strong. We have a very, particularly in radio for some reason, and Indigenous media, there's quite a bit of really good, there's great work in the community, but it's very, very small amount of the media that is consumed. The group I was speaking with today, the Indigenous group, they're actually talking about, the Indigenous media is actually really building up because the mainstream media has so badly treated them for so many years that they've got their own YouTube channels now. They've got also, because media is so much easier to make now, you don't have to have a big expensive studio to create amazing work. So yeah, they're really taking it back in a way, really fragmenting the sector, which is good for them. And I'm supporting them doing, I'm actually supporting the program making. So I'm not unhappy about it. Manuel, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me? Okay, good. I was just curious to see if you have any more information about young people, like pre-university, first-year university students. I'm looking at the behavior of those people, mostly in social conversation online. And what we see, or what we've seen so far, is that girls in Portugal have learned to stay with their mouths shut. This is what they actually say, because they are scared of what may come as a reaction in social networks. But when they are in a safe space, like in a school or university organized debate, and they feel safer, then they have a lot to say, and they become quite political about diversity, about girls' rights, and so on. So I was curious to see if maybe there is something similar happening in Australia, because one of the things that I see in Portugal is that sort of middle working class and working class, middle upper class are not still political about this. People stay quiet. So there is the abuse, and people, the reaction that you get most of the time is that most people stay quiet, which is, but to me, it's totally unacceptable, but it does happen. And I see it on Twitter. I see, for example, that only like really like PhD level people become political about it and say, this is unacceptable, which is something that you don't see, for example, in the UK, and I guess in Australia is a little similar to the UK. Just wanted to see what your comments were.
Look, it's not an area of research for me, but what I can tell you though, in the last, the Australian of the Year this year was a young woman called Grace Tame, and she was named the Australian Woman of the Year, or Person of the Year, for campaigning to overturn a law which stopped women who had been raped from being publicly named. And she's, which meant that if someone who had been assaulted wanted to talk about her experience in the media, she wasn't allowed to do that. And so Grace overcame that. And in doing that, she was the one of a number of women who have made public allegations against men very high profile politicians. On the back of that, there's been a whole movement in schools of young women calling out sexual predators in high schools. And there's petitions going around. I think they're doing the same in the UK. And there is a lot in that space that's, so there's a lot of incredibly impressive young women out there. But my gut tells me that what you're saying is still true, that there is, you know, some amazingly brave, you know, young women, but a lot of them don't want to be out there. I certainly know I've got teenage boys though. I don't see any of their comments publicly. I know they're all in safe spaces where, you know, annoying mothers can't see. You know, I think that's yeah, it's I'm sure that what you're seeing is exactly the same here, but yes, I've got nothing to base it on other than my own experiences. But the Grace Tame issue, or what's happening with young women refusing to be quiet, and there were big marches here this year around women's rights, which were beautiful. Actually, they were the most out of all the protests I've ever been to. It was, you know, young women through to very old women, just basically saying enough is enough, and we need to stop this. So there's a lot of good stuff happening as well.
Yeah, just as a side comment, one of the big issues we have here, which I didn't know anything about until recently, is that many girls, especially in middle working classes, begin relationships with boys very, very early, and they send intimate photos to them, to the then boyfriends, who then blackmail them after the end of the relationship. And then sometimes they even post these intimate photos on Instagram and stuff like that. And I thought it would be like an isolated kind of once in a while event, but it's not at all. It's very, very common, and it's horrible. But that's a side comment.
Yeah, no, well, no, it's something, I mean, I get notices about that from my boys' schools, from the schools, you know, it's certainly out there. You know, yes, and it does happen far too frequently. Yeah. Interestingly, though, you know, during this whole COVID period, when my boys have been at home for 150 days of schooling, they refuse to turn on their cameras because, you know, you shouldn't have your cameras on in your bedroom, because they've been taught that that's not the right thing to do. And yeah, I think it's just an excuse, really.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Lots of facts and figures, not as an interactive as I intended, but as I was trying to set up at the beginning, it's quite a difficult time to work at the moment, but we're getting there.
I'm not sure if there is any other question from, okay, Svea, go ahead.
Yeah, it's more of a curiosity, because when you were talking about the news bargaining code, I remember following the time when everything got banned from Facebook, and I am kind of conflicted, because in the one hand, of course, social media platforms shouldn't be able to profit from the work that is from news journalists. But at the same time, I got the feeling, especially seeing your figures, that it reinforced the power structures that already existed, and it put a lot of power and money in the hands of the people who already had it. So I was thinking, are there any attempts at changing policy to benefit independent news media, or to equal the playing field? Because it could be a really good way to get funding for those kinds of things.
Oh, absolutely, Sophia. It's a really live debate. And if you've got some really good ideas, we would like to hear it. You know, someone came up with an idea that the Australian Broadcasting Corporation should have its own, you know, social media site run by the ABC. But the ABC, because it's publicly funded and because it is very successful, it's the most trusted news source in Australia. News Corporation has been running a campaign against the ABC. So the ABC's funding's kept on being cut and cut. I don't think that with a Conservative government at the moment that would get up. But I do think that would be a way to have, you know, I mean, I know for many countries, like Americans can't understand how how important our ABC is to us, and don't understand how we can have that separation of powers between a government-funded broadcaster and independent journalism. But it really is. It's a good corporation. It serves Australia really well, and I would like to see something like that. I don't know how we can support commercial news outlets. You know, many of the towns are just too small. You know, for the to have more than one or two journalists. And certainly, you know, print is very expensive. We do need to improve our internet. I mean, it's all interrelated, isn't it? You know, you've got, you know, functional literacy, you've got media literacy, you've got infrastructure issues, gender issues. There's so much to be done.
Yeah, it's a tough question, but I don't know. It feels like at least something is moving. So let's hope for.
Yeah, I think we've made some really important headway in the last few years. I'm actually impressed by this government and what they did in the media bargaining code. I mean, Google and Facebook were not happy with it. You know, but at least for the moment, it's gotten us through COVID, and we've just got to figure out a way to get people to pay for news.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the lecture. It was really interesting.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you. Perhaps one last question before Maria José closes today's session, or a final comment. If there is no further question or further comment, I will then pass over to Maria José. Thank you very, very, very much, Alexandra. It was a fantastic presentation, full of food for thought. It's certainly for us over in this other side of the globe. There are many areas of convergence, but also very specific information that you have provided us. That I think it was also very enriching for all of us here and the other indirect audience, which will be able to see this video in full in a few days via YouTube. So again, thank you very much. Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada a todos. Obrigada também a todos os presentes. Maria José, passo então a palavra.
Okay, thank you so much. I will repeat Celia's thoughts. Thank you so much, Alexandra. It was really inspiring. Unfortunately, we will have a lot of work ahead, and you too. So let's hope that in the future we can have another talk or webinar with you, updating your future work. So thank you so much. And I will just say that this month we will have a MELSI Lab talk that will be done by Célia Taborda, that is our colleague at Cant. So I've placed the details in the chat, and soon we will also send out a more detailed information. So thank you so much, and have all of you have a good weekend and a good new school year. And Alexandra, thank you so much again, and also to all colleagues that attended this so interesting webinar. Thank you.